welcome you all today to the third of four events on delivering international A-level English. My name is Therese Kenny. I've been working with Edexcel in a variety of roles for over 20 years now, as well as working in education in both UK domestic and international centres. We hope today will be a useful exercise for you as we explore Unit 3 in more detail and hopefully give opportunities for people to share ideas or consider challenges that we might have in helping our candidates achieve and perform. What we will be doing today is we will be working through a series of activities, and I will be allowing you to respond both with the chat box and with your microphones where possible. I'm just going to remove my video now, both to clarify the audio and also to allow you to focus on the presentation. So thank you once again for taking time to be with us this morning, and hopefully you will gain some helpful information about Unit 3. So we're thinking about A-level English literature, and we're hoping that we will be looking at assessment objectives that relate to Unit 3, using questions from recent question papers and thinking about how a candidate may approach or answer the question using feedback from the examiner's reports. Through the morning, we'll be looking at strategies for teaching and thinking about the ways in which students can access the question and target the different assessment objectives. Hopefully throughout, there'll be a chance for you to network and share best practice. And as we said, there will be mainly chat function, and you may wish to sort of make other contributions as the morning continues. Pearson works as both the UK's largest awarding organisation and worldwide, with over 3.5 million students a year, with a long heritage in education and a background in a range of areas. Looking at the qualification, we are looking to build on knowledge, skills and understanding developed at GCSE or IGCSE, although we know that there are also candidates who come to the qualification with other exams. So it's not necessary, but there is a sense of a foundation and build. You'll find the International A-level quite similar to the UK domestic qualification for those of you who are in a position to deliver both, and you may even find that some resources should be interchangeable. We're looking to take candidate knowledge and skills and to ask them to perform in an integrated and coherent way. And we're going to be talking about this quite a lot this morning, the idea of cogency and bringing through the assessment objectives throughout the candidate responses. We know that some students approach this as a modular qualification, while others approach it as a linear qualification, and we'll be considering maybe those possibilities this morning. Reminding ourselves of our units, we have the 4-unit full A-level, we see the examinations, we have a series of open book 2-hour exams. They do present challenges in different ways, dependent on genre or the task ahead, and we'll be approaching that as we go through the meeting today. Just a note on our assessment objectives and weighting. Different elements of the qualification carry different weight, and one thing that we would say that is key as we move through questions is that we certainly look for a holistic approach to marking. And what we mean by that is when we look at our units and how the AOs are addressed, we're not saying that a necessary amount of marks are allocated for each AO. We're saying that the candidate achieves a mark for the performance across their assessment objectives. So although it ends up weighted to a certain percentage of grade, we certainly wouldn't be saying so many marks for a particular AO, and we must sort of keep that in mind as we work through. Looking at today's unit, we're thinking about Section A and Section B and where the various AOs will be targeted. The point of assessment objectives is to assure consistency and fairness across units, across centres, and ultimately across qualifications, so that a candidate can be confident that there is sort of parity of achievement and clarity. We're looking to test our subject appropriately and gain validity. And the assessment objectives will hopefully provide shared reference points, both for those who set the papers, the examiners, the teachers, and ultimately the candidates. And we're running this process through at least twice a year. So this morning's focus is poetry and prose. Our One exam is 2 hours open book with clean copies, so we can't have annotations or any sort of additions or notes. It's in 2 sections, A and B, and you'll notice that unlike paper 1 and paper 2, there is a slight difference in the weighting of the marks on this paper. So we're doing 20 marks for section A with the unseen component, and then 30 marks weighting for section B. So that is maybe a slight difference to the AS. We're looking at unseen elements and poetry in section A, and moving on to paired thematically linked novels for a response for section B. And we can see here the current choices for the prose. In each question, candidates will be provided with 2 options, and of course they're only asked to complete 1. So they will do 1 essay from 2 in each section. So we'll make a start by thinking about the unseen post-1900 poetry. And at this point, I will be making references on the slides, and I can put part of the poem up. But if you have got your resource pack, you'll probably find it useful to look at the 2406 and the 2401 past papers. We'll be mainly referring to the unseen question, and we'll be doing a few activities or a few reflections based on those. In terms of what the specification is mandating, what we expect to see, we're thinking about how candidates apply their poetry learning. So yes, I do apologise. Thank you, Claire. 2401 is indeed January 2024 and June 2024. In terms of how it's written as your document label, that's where you should see the 2401 and the 2406 in the delegate pack. But that's how it translates to the January and the June sittings. Apologies, Claire, it was how the document was listed in the delegate pack, so it was just so the candidates could find that. So we're looking at poetry learning, and we are looking to see that we certainly have aspects of form and structure covered, language choice, imagery, symbols and motifs, rhyme and rhythm, the themes that might be covered, might consider aspects of tone and mood, and the sense of voice created. And that might be a consideration of speaker, or it might be consideration of maybe the purpose of the poem. We want candidates to be prepared to show their knowledge and understanding of obviously the function of key features in poetry and what they may be used for and how they may convey ideas in a particular way. We might also ask them to consider the range of ways of reading poetry. So it could be looking for the detail and how the poet uses an adapted language, and it could also be the idea of responding in a critical or a creative way. We're hoping that candidates will communicate their ideas fluently with some accuracy and show effectively their knowledge, understanding, and critical evaluation. We'll ask them to identify and explore certain attitudes and values expressed in the poetry, and that will link to the key terms of particular questions. It's hoped that the candidates for AO1 and AO2 will use literary critical concepts and terminology with some understanding and discrimination, although we would discourage a feature spotting. We're not asking them just to label particular features, but think in a meaningful way of how writers are using certain techniques to achieve a particular purpose or to present a particular theme. We'd like them to make appropriate use of conventions of their literary study, thinking accurately about texts and sources where that is relevant. When we think about poetry, and we asked a similar question in the Unit 1 meeting, we considered how centres approach this. And certainly in that meeting, predominantly centres and delegates said that they worked with poem by poem. But the question is, with the unseen in particular, is there a chance for you to front load the main features of poetry and teach them through short examples or a range from various timelines or genres, and then ask candidates to apply them to the unseen or to apply them to anthology poems that they've not yet encountered? It might be an interesting point to reflect upon. Are you covering texts as individual poems and then bringing in some unseens of your choice? Or are you possibly asking candidates to do some independent learning with those anthology poems that you have not yet reached? Have you found that it's mainly revision of existing knowledge? Or do you feel at this point, particularly for the A-level unseen, that there may be some teaching of new material? So I'd invite you at this point, if anyone wishes to sort of comment on these points and how they might be presenting poetry in their centre. If you wish to sort of make some comments now, sort of to share what you're doing. As we said with Unit 1, we felt many delegates were taking a poem by poem approach. Do you continue with this with Unit 3, or are you deciding to do the front loading or revising the anthology poems as a way into working with unseen texts and thinking about advantages and drawbacks? So do feel free to sort of add some comments to the chat box, and we'll consider those as we work through the activities. Unseen poetry can feel challenging, but it is largely about developing and extending existing skills. So the hope would be that through the AS in Unit 1, that their core subject knowledge is secure. And despite that, candidates do tend to become quite anxious about this part of the course, and they feel this is possibly the most difficult aspect, the sense they feel that they cannot train or prepare for it. When in fact, we look at the fact that they have the toolkit, and it's putting that toolkit to use in the unit. A lot of what we do for Section A will be about increasing confidence so that they don't develop that anxiety about the unseen. So knowing that they have got the knowledge and just spotting those links and looking for ways of bringing in the existing knowledge. If we could just ask now, if you'd like to share, have you got a favourite approach to introducing the unseen? So what have you done in the past for reducing candidate anxiety? So what do you tend to sort of say to the students when you begin the unit? So if anyone would like to share a comment or thoughts in terms of how they approach the unseen part of the course. And you may feedback through the microphone or through the chat box. So it would allow you to share with the group. So one point here, if we did a bit of an informal poll, how many of you would start preparing unseen right from the beginning, right from the first year? And how many perhaps prefer to leave it to the second year or the full A-level course? So would you say that you work on unseen from the very beginning, or is it left in terms of the order that you take the units? Yes, so we have Gemma says preferring to work with the second year. And maybe as we say through that, you might be sort of building on their confidence and building on their experience of sitting Unit 1. Absolutely. The idea of using the anthology poems as unseen can be a form of a shortcut, and we can sort of encourage that independent learning and that reducing anxiety. If we're saying you can look at this poem and how would you deal with it? How would you unpack it? And where are the themes? And what do you see in terms of link techniques? What do? We can start with basic annotations, particularly with questions, looking at key and command words. And we could even just use titles of poems to get candidates used to beginning to decode meanings. So taking the title away from a poem and asking the student to make a prediction or an assumption about what happens. And I like Claire's point about the muscle that needs exercising. So it's this idea that the more often it gets exercised, and it's the nutshell understanding is so important. And if they're flexing that muscle all of the time, then it should become something where they can achieve and perform and show us what they can do. So ways that we can go into it. We've mentioned this idea of using the anthology to allow candidates to practice unseen. So looking maybe forward to those poems that you haven't covered collectively and thinking about it as the student using their toolkit and looking at things like the titles, opening lines or closing lines to make predictions, sections of imagery. So we can take some imagery out of a poem and look at it in isolation and work at, I like to call it sometimes, doing the lot with a little. So we take a small section, a small phrase, a cluster of images, and we try and discuss those and consider connotations before looking at the poem in the whole. And Gemma, you have this point of calling it getting to the heart of the poem. And this idea, as you said, of sort of the dissection to a certain degree and looking at what's there and how can we sort of work out what the writer is trying to achieve. There's another example here. It says we could select 10 keywords. So we could just use those words and again ask the candidates to unpick or unfurl those connotations or those predictions about themes. It can be useful sometimes to model different ways of annotating the unseen poem, and that can be both on hard copy, on paper, and on a digital or print version. So we're looking at the idea of ways of annotating. Some candidates can be more visual learners and they may like to color code or group or mind map. Some candidates like a more linear approach and they like to work through line by line. And it's using variation of models, and that can really help. So candidates, we're matching their learning styles, we're matching how they sort of achieve confidence in working alone. We might ask them to pick their own examples. So we can model one example of a short section or an image, and then we'll ask them to do the same and set questions either for the class or for pairs. And then we could create mnemonics. And there is a caveat that we do try to use those with caution. So we could work through with some of those tried and tested formula that we've maybe had from GCSE and IGCSE. And there's nothing wrong with that as an absolute starting point to give that candidate confidence that they're dealing with certain aspects of the poem. But we do want them to move beyond. We do want them to develop that personal response that we're looking for in each unit. We'll begin with a question from June 2024. So we have some GCSE activities as well that Claire's mentioned, like giving a first line only and a close, thinking about some of the poem and what the gaps would include. And then that can get you into a conversation about connotations and symbolism and whether the poem is going where we thought it might. And that in itself can bring out issues of personal interpretation. So looking at the June 2024 question, it was a poem which is on page 2 of the source booklet. If you're struggling to get it to hand, I will put it onto the screen momentarily. But the question was writing a commentary for the poem Monologue for an Onion. And we'll see the format of these questions remains consistent. We'll ask the candidates to remember to consider the ways in which a poet might develop theme, the ways they make use of language and imagery, and the use of other poetic techniques. So for this poem, we are going to have a look at it, as we said. If you have your delegate pack and in the resources, if you need to find resources, by the way, if you follow the small 3 dots where it says more and go to resources, that will open those for you as well. And thank you, Antoinette. Antoinette's also put the link into the chat box, and that should take you directly to it. So we'd say take a moment to read or remind yourself of the poem. What we'll do is we'll be using the chat box to raise the discussion and counterpoints with each other. We'll think about, imagine we are the candidate approaching this for the first time. If we're identifying what themes do we feel are being developed, elements of the poet's language and imagery that we might want to focus on to answer a question, any poetic techniques that you might like to comment on, and the poem's effectiveness. And we're just trying to sort of find or maybe identify those. And the key thing actually is this final bullet, this idea of the opening sentence. If the candidate can clearly present a personal response and a position to the poem early in their response, as we're saying, possibly even in the opening sentence, they give us a clear view that they have developed an interpretation, which hopefully they will go on to support in their answer. So if we just sort of take a momentary look at the, I'll just stop the share. Okay, so I will just share with you in a moment the poem if you've not been able to source it yet. It's Monologue for an Onion. And if you've not quite found it, we have it on the screen as well. And those key things that students as candidates might be thinking of, we're looking at potential development of themes. We're looking at any commentary that we might want to make about techniques, what we're noticing about it. And if we think we can take ourselves to that point, it's this idea of that opening zinger, if you like. How would we open a response to our commentary here, and what have we noticed? So just give yourself a moment to read. And then if you do want to use the chat box, and in any order, the sorts of comments that might reflect a candidate first response. So we're looking here for potential themes that could be discussed in terms of how the poet is developing the theme, any techniques that might be worthy of mention or evaluation, anything that we might note in terms of those structural or poetic devices that we feel would be relevant in an unseen commentary. And if we're feeling that we've got this grasp on it, what would we maybe suggest to candidates as a good opening sentence or a good opening position? And if you can just share those through chat as they come to you, so we don't need it in full sentences for ourselves today. And certainly we'd hope candidates would engage with this sort of unusual form, with the direct address, the onion speaking to the person who is making the cut. And then thinking about that sort of symbolic layer of meaning. And it may sound strange to speak of the voice of the onion, but it is a monologue for an onion. So what do we feel candidates might pick out with this poem? Words we might be using in terms of tone. And if I could just encourage you just to share your thoughts, if we could, through the chat box. And that way we hopefully will get to share some ideas or approaches. What techniques might you say the poet is using? And do feel free to sort of add those points as I go through the next section. So this idea of we're still thinking about what would the candidate have done. So do please add those thoughts while we go. We're looking at discussion of themes, discussion of elements of language and imagery, other techniques, structural techniques, effectiveness, and that idea of the key opening response. So thinking about it and possible indicative content, things that students may approach, in terms of looking at, as we said, this idea of the voice of the onion and the tone that might be adopted. And there is that shift, isn't there, where the address becomes slightly more aggressive, and how might that sort of link to purpose? And when you're thinking of your own responses, if you've not sort of recorded them, but if you're reflecting on your own ideas, which of these responses would you say or describe as mark scheme adjacent? And what we mean by that is, do you feel there's similarities when you've looked at the mark scheme to the ways you think your students would have responded? Or actually, would you say there are additional points that could be raised? Because the key with the indicative content when we look at mark schemes is it's there as a guide, but it is allowing candidates to make other equally valid interpretations as well. Do you teach your students about this idea of the importance of the opening sentence and the importance of taking a position? And obviously with unseen, it can seem a little bit daunting for the candidate because it is their first experience of the text, but the sense that they've read it, they've made an interpretation, and they're going to try and explore the extent to which they believe it's a valid interpretation. Is there any way you feel candidates may have misconstrued the question or struggled with it? And if there was sort of a case of looking at where candidates may have gone versus the suggested indicative content, how could we change, and how could you sort of advise the candidate to steer them in a direction? And then lastly, if we think about asking students to evaluate, and we're saying, is a poem effective? And what we mean there is, is it effective in doing what the candidate believes it's trying to do? And it's always this case of evaluating it with a critical eye. So not merely saying I like or I do not like this poem, but thinking about the purpose of it and whether they feel it's achieved that, or whether it has created a degree of ambiguity and confusion. So the examiner's report does stress the idea about planning. And they're saying that planning is time that is so important, particularly for this unit. And we'll be looking now at a second poem. So if you look at your delegate pack, we'll be looking at the January 2024 question paper. And this was on the unseen poem, This Is How They Came Back to Us, by Barbara Kingsolver. And we can see again that for unseen, the introduction to a guided commentary, we're leaving it deliberately open so the candidate can come at it from a variety of approaches. We're looking again at this idea of how the poet develops themes, what they notice or what they observe in terms of use of language and imagery, and where they think there's maybe room to make significant comments on any other poetic techniques. So if you just want to take a moment to find the poem, and again, just refresh your memory, if you had taken the January sitting, if it's new to you, just take a moment or two to read it. And that is the January 2024, labelled 2401. And we'll be looking in a moment at brief plans based on the mark scheme. And that's quite a key thing, using mark schemes to help with teaching and learning. And obviously, as teachers, we may use these, for example, when we're setting mock assessment, but there are other ways we can use the mark scheme. We can take it and we can look at indicative content, and we can use it to help students structure a skeleton plan and think about developing answers, particularly with that unseen poetry, where they may have a degree of anxiety and they may need just that extra level of support, as we said earlier, to flex that muscle and to get to the heart of those poems. So it's thinking about using the indicative content and sharing it with candidates, and looking at previous exam series and thinking about, okay, we can use this as a revision aid. We can use it as a sensible starting point. So we're encouraging candidates to have a dialogue with the mark scheme. We're encouraging them to look at it and maybe annotate the points they feel they would have raised, or alternative points, or points maybe they hadn't thought of, and then to produce new plans and possibly peer review them with a classmate. They might then look at the plan and add quotations or reference. They might use flashcards or even adapt a question and consider ways in which they would sort of address it. So we'll have a look in a moment at This Is How They Come Back to Us. If you have it in your delegate pack, just refresh yourself. And some of the things that you may have noticed is we could look at themes such as memory, loss, or love. They may be focused on how the diction presents these key themes. So we're trying to be specific. If we're saying that we feel there is this discussion of the memory, or the idea of loss and the idea of love and how that ties together, we might look at very simple, very pertinent quotes. So the end suggesting sort of finality, the imagery and symbolism. So the sense of something here, it says melting clear, the use of poetic techniques to complement the presentation. So sibilance and thinking about where the sibilance occurs and what is the effect or the impact of it, and how might that support your reading of the poem so far. Structural points as usual. We're looking at things like rhythm, verse, enjambment, caesura, but a key point is thinking about the relevance of those aspects. And obviously with an unseen, it can be maybe that little bit more challenging. But if, for example, you see an enjambment and there is the run-on line, consider why is that happening at that point in time? Is it a flow of thoughts, like a stream of consciousness? Is it the fact that a character is excitable or passionate? And it's linking the structural or the formal point to part of the interpretation, to part of the personal response. And that's where we'll get marks for evaluation. It's avoiding just the simple feature spotting of where they can see a rhythm or a rhyme scheme. And it's looking at what impact is that particular example of the formal structure having on the understanding of the meaning of the poem. It's looking at how a voice is created. So is it using first person, as in sort of the monologue of the onion, sort of speaking out? And is it overall effective in conveying the themes that the student thinks they've identified? So it's taking general points on theme, but then linking those to examples of diction, examples of imagery, examples of poetic technique. And it's trying to present the student's view. We know this is their first time encountering the poems, but we're asking them to try and present a reading based on what they've noticed, based on the patterns that they can see. If we just, as we say, bring this one up, we have certainly there a very unusual formatting in terms of where it lies off centre, and we'd expect candidates to engage with that at a certain point. Likewise, we can look at the line demarcation and think more closely about why we have those divides. And the I is certainly a personal voice, as we've had in the previous poem. And possibly this sense of nostalgia. Looking at the ending, looking at the opening, as we said before, and commenting on, thinking of that prediction activity earlier on. If you'd used the opening and you predicted a certain direction the poem would go into, do you feel that your expectations were met, or did you feel that actually they were subverted or challenged by the time you reached the end of the poem? So those are ways that the candidate, as we say, can engage in that more meaningful way with the text in that short amount of time. So we'd mentioned monologue of an onion. One task you may want to do with your students is give the following steers and ask them either to find or identify examples in the poem or to broadly state what they see. So it could be a direct reference, or it could be linking direct references through to the techniques that they have spotted. So making a comment both on technique and then supporting it with those specific examples. And you would ask them to build the plan and then maybe vary or adapt the plan. And it can be worth with your students looking at the indicative content side by side from, say, two, as it is here, concurrent series, the June and the January, and ask them to look for or spot consistent elements of indicative content. So things that we would normally expect students to see in a poem. They could use mnemonics to help prepare. So I know students do like to maybe use that as a memory tool. They could also try to build their own reading in terms of taking the theme and linking it through to techniques and then to evaluation of techniques, and finally linking it in with effectiveness. So thinking about what is the writer doing, how is the reader responding, and therefore is it effective in doing what the candidate believes it's trying to do. And we did say there's always a point of balance. We've got to try and show that we have an understanding of poetry as a genre, But it is an area where we want to avoid the so-called feature spotting. And I think particularly with unseen, candidates do become a little bit anxious, and they are keen to show that they know some of the poetic techniques, but they must always think, as we had with Unit 1, are they making a point relevant to interpreting what they feel the meaning of the poem is? So they want to avoid taking a list-like approach, and they also want to keep time management. We are aware that they have a lot to do in this time, and they need to make sure that they don't maybe spend too much time there when Section B does have that slightly higher weighting. Looking at the idea of commenting on language choice, and it is about balance, and particularly on the unseen, as we said, where the test is to make a commentary on a poem they have not encountered before. We do need the commentary on that language choice, but we don't want, as it said, this point with lower band answers that may just focus on diction and not much else. So it's about getting the balance right. We do realise in the time allowed that candidates may initially begin by looking at language, but we also want them to think about thematic content, and we also want them to think every time they focus on a technical feature, evaluation and linking it to their personal reading. So the technical feature should not be addressed in isolation. Everything that they feel they need to talk about, evaluate its effectiveness and think how it either supports or in some cases may challenge their initial impression and reading of what the poem means. And we did say that sometimes candidates do want to show you what they can do, and there is that danger where they try to bring in as many terms as possible and potentially partially understood. So it's about getting the balance and about them having a confidence in their own voice. We want to see their personal interpretation backed by the critical concepts. Not sort of led by concepts that are not evaluated. So it's getting that balance right. So every time we see a use of a term, get the student to ask themselves, is it relevant? And have they shown their comprehension? Have they shown their understanding? And have they shown how that particular feature supports their reading or supports their response to the poem? Endings can be important. So we could encourage students to focus in on conclusion moments. The idea of thinking right at the start about how they will visualize the end of their argument. And again, with unseens, this can present a challenge because they are working in a live environment, but they may find it helpful to use this idea of the killer closing line. Read the poem, come up with an interpretation, identify or annotate those features of theme, those features of technique, and then think about how would I finish or clinch my argument. And we advise not to just simply use the key term of a question, so not just to simply say, I have dealt with themes, diction, etc., but to think back to if the poem has maybe a particular title, could they reference that? If, again, we have those opening, closing lines of the poem itself, could they maybe address those or show us that they are reaching to the end of their argument, the end of their interpretation? And this can be enjoyable. We do look at students, and the personal response in the unseen is very enjoyable in terms of candidates engaging and challenging and doing something new. So we've said about flexing muscles, we've said about getting to the heart of something. This is their chance to really demonstrate their skills and look at exploring literature in a fresh way. And as we said, not necessarily saying this poem is boring or I didn't very much like this at all. So for this activity, we have an ending. And this is from the commentary on Monologue to an Onion. So these are the final sentences from a candidate's response. And they've said, overall, Monologue for an Onion presents themes of mockery, emotion, misplaced feelings, and avoidance. It discusses reasonings as well as the effects, leaving a reader to realise their own action to themselves and others in their own personal lives. So if you could use the chat box, please. Two elements I'd like you to comment on. First of all, sort of thoughts on this, any particular strengths you think it might have, any areas where we could develop it. And then would you like to, it's difficult because we don't have the whole response here, but would you like to hazard a level that you feel this candidate may have achieved based on this conclusion. So if we could type our thoughts into the chat box. So it is just chat and you can just work through and type your ideas here, as we can see. And we're asking two things. Any comments on either strength or areas for development? And would you like to posit where you think this is in terms of a level on the 5 levels? And this being the final few sentences of a whole response. And I would encourage chat box comments. We are now in the 3rd meeting, and we had some really illuminating comments from other delegates and centres in the previous meetings. It really does help, because sometimes others can have a thought that we've maybe not had ourselves. So don't be shy. Do pop down what you think. So things you might want to think about. Do we have some evidence of personal response? Does the candidate's view seem to be clear and relevant? Have they perhaps supported their view or not? And if we think about levels and performance descriptors, it's difficult when we have a few lines, but are we looking at clear and relevant? Are we looking at controlled and discriminating? Are we looking higher than that? Yeah, top level 2 into 3, generic. Yeah, Faith, you're not far off there actually with that one. It's very sort of mid in the mark range, and as you said, that sort of borderline. There is some relevance, but we're seeing maybe no support. And a bigger picture would boost it. So definitely. Anyone else want to add? So if we are saying it is pretty much a mid response, it's falling pretty much within the median, just as Faith said, into that level 3. Anyone want to give us some comments on what you could tell this candidate if you wanted to give them advice on how to get a secure 3 or a level 4? And reminding ourselves it is just their conclusion. Thanks, Faith, for getting the ball rolling. If this was your candidate, what would you maybe advise them to do to improve the conclusion? Faith's reference, as we said, maybe lack of support, although we wouldn't expect more than a brief support in the final paragraph. Bigger picture of the poem, I mean, certainly we don't seem to get an idea that it's the onion having the voice, so that's not maybe coming across. And yes, the they themselves is possibly quite broad. Certainly, Claire, that's our key, isn't it? We'd like to see more evaluation of effectiveness. That's one of the key elements. If we're feeling that this poem is requiring the reader to reflect, in what way would it do it? Yes, the unusual voice, this is an onion, and we don't really see that in the end, do we? And it wouldn't take very much for this candidate to enhance and enrich this. And it's just about avoiding those generalities, avoiding using terms like them, their, themselves. Personal lives is still quite broad. We have, yes, what emotions, what feelings. There's many ways they could tweak this, isn't there? There's many ways they could sort of refine. So there's a number of actions this candidate could take. We can be more specific with emotions and feelings. We can reference the fact that the onion has a voice, so that is a highly unusual narrative perspective and highly unusual poetic voice. We could reference the idea of the dramatic monologue as a generic form in poetry, and it does have a history. We could reference again that specificity of what is it possibly, asking the reader or the audience to do, the immediate audience within the poem, the person cutting the onion, and then this wider audience of readership. So we could really work with this, and we could sort of develop and enrich it with a few key ideas. We're going to end this part of the session with a marking activity. And for this one, you will be given a few minutes to read the response of script A. It's a complete answer to the question 1. We'll give you some time to do that. You do probably need to reference your mark scheme in the delegate pack as well. So you'll be looking at script A. You'll be essentially looking at levels. So don't worry too much about placing it with a mark, although feel free to if you wish so. But we're looking to sort of read that response and think about what level would this have achieved. So you'll need to look at 2 documents essentially. In your delegate pack, you'll be looking at script A, and then you will need to work with page 6 of the mark scheme, which is the performance indicators. So it's your grid that will tell you what performance should look like at each level. And if you take sort of a few moments with that one, so we will give a few minutes, and then we will take a feedback. So take some time with it. It would be nice to see as many of you as possible commenting in the chat box with this one. So if we give this, let's just look at our times now. If we give this one 5 minutes, and then at the end of the 5 minutes, if you can post your level and maybe just a comment on why you felt it was in that level. So it's script A. I'll leave the chat box open. So equally, if there's any sort of questions on what we've done so far or any comments, if something's come to you from an earlier slide, do just pop those through. I'll keep an eye and I'll monitor them. And then we'll feed back in 5 minutes. We'll sort of look at what the script achieved. So it's script A, and it's the June 2024. That's the 2406 mark scheme. And the performance grid is on page 6. And it's our onion. Let's now use the chat function to share the level that you feel it achieved. And again, we don't need sort of full sentences, but if we could just have comments, what maybe made you choose this level in terms of if we're looking at the arguments, if we're looking at the use of the concepts and the terminology. So we're thinking AO1 and AO2. Where would you feel you would place script A? Okay, thank you for that response. So you're definitely saying you feel that there's logical and clear coming through. So thank you, David. So you're saying that there is quite a lot of, as you would say, sophisticated language, although maybe not always successful. And you definitely feel you see enough for 3. In fact, you're saying possibly aspects of 3 are missing. So it would be script A, the unseen. So we're thinking 3. And then again, if other delegates could add, sort of add where we feel. Do we feel it's 3? Do we feel it achieves slightly more than that? Okay, and Faith, we're saying that we think mid-level 4. Possibly, that's a very important point you're raising, Faith, actually. We do need to remember what we're asking candidates to do. We have a time period, it is an unseen. We're seeing, we feel they're seeing some discrimination, although the evaluation isn't there. We saw that in the previous one on the previous slide. So you were feeling possibly the top of 4 and possibly a 17. And a level 4, Victor. So any more takers on level 4, high 4? Yeah, so we seem to be coming in on high 4. And yes, so that's quite encouraging to see, actually, because yes, that's where we felt. We felt secure level 4. And having said that, recognizing, going back to your points, David, about, aspects where the candidate maybe wasn't wholly clear. But overall, given the task, given that it is the unseen, given that there is a time limit, given that the student is shaping the personal response on a text that they've not worked with before, there are sort of elements of control and elements of fluently embedded examples. There is sort of some use of discrimination in the concept and terminology. And as many of you have recognized, it's to a point, so it's not totally there. It's not wholly discriminating. There is some precision, and we use the phrase more or less cohesive, so we could see where they were going, but maybe it wasn't always sort of securely grasped. Again, analysis is relatively controlled. So relatively controlled, so we know that it wasn't 100% there for the absolute top of 4, but we think certainly on balance, and that's why I've brought David's comment back in, because there were a few little elements that we might consider to be 3s. But overall, on balance, going through the assessment objectives, reminding ourselves that it is the unseen and that it is timed and it has got that slightly lower weighting. We feel that there's enough achievement across the AOs, 1 and 2, that there are strengths to the answer, although it is, I think the word we have here is diffuse in places, that we have got some points that are less convincing, some points that have some very nice words. So I think you really hit it, some nice vocabulary, but maybe not always saying what the candidate thinks it's saying. But overall, certainly enough to get. And it's good to see that we sort of started to agree on that, sort of a secure, well into 4. So we're looking, high in 4, but not at the very top. And what could we do for this candidate if we were trying to get them either to that very top of 4, or even challenge them, get them to aspire to that, sort of moving into level 5? What sort of advice could we give them, if they had a chance to work over and improve their answer? And what sort of tips could we give them to either totally secure the 4 or maybe even stretch for that 5? Anyone like to sort of add their comment, their supportive advice, if this was your candidate? Some of the things that you've all already mentioned, it doesn't have that precision at times. It does have a few, should we say, diffuse passages. And it's getting it right, isn't it? It's getting that grasp and security with the terms, but using them to feed into the evaluation, using them to make a supporting argument for your personal response. And if we can keep encouraging students to go back to that, that will help them just push and lift that performance, just those few extra marks. And likewise, I did refer back to, as we say, we're mostly fours, but we had some elements of three. This candidate is one of those, aren't they, that, we think they could achieve great things, but equally, if they're not careful with the control and the clarity, we could slip down, couldn't we? So it's about trying to get them confident in flexing their poetry muscles, but making sure they maybe read over and look. And this could be a candidate where that planning comes in again. We did say the examiner's report talked about planning. So it might be a case of, make sure you know where you're going with your answer before you start. Make sure you've got an idea about your response and you're working through. Yes, exactly. So this advice about not rushing, that's an excellent point as well. This idea of not feeling you have to cover the whole poem, because, as you said, time is of the essence, and the sense of evaluating before the moving in. And I think that's very good advice. It's that advice that, in terms of what we're expecting, we don't want that line by line sort of chronological approach. We want them to, as you say, take that big picture and then do the move in and then consider the shifts. So I think that would be a perfect piece of advice. I would sort of second that. So where we are now is we have now come to your very well-deserved well-being break for those of us who have been here for a moment. So we'd say, if you would like to just take those 5 or 10 minutes, if we say we meet back, if we have everyone back online for 8 minutes past, I know that sounds a little bit awkward, but it gives you a chance just to sort of get yourself away from keyboard and get maybe a refreshment. And we'll resume at 8 minutes past. What may be useful, or some people find useful, was that I will stay and monitor the chat box. So if you have got a question or you missed a bit, I know some people have had some teaching demands this morning. If there's a little bit you need clarification on, I'll try and sort of respond to those as best I can in the break. So do sort of enjoy your brief break, and we'll be back together at 8 minutes past, and I'll see you then. So see you shortly. Thank you. So hopefully everyone's had some opportunity to have a little away from keyboard, and you're suitably refreshed as we make our way through to section B. So we're looking now at section B and the paired prose. So that's where we're moving to now. So just a reminder to ourselves what we're looking for. We are working across the range of objectives, so everything bar AO5, and we've got our AO1, AO2, as we would expect, but we're now looking at the influence of the contexts and the significance, and we'll be thinking about this idea of significance and how it's important and what that might look like in an answer. And then with our pairings, we're thinking about how we can meaningfully explore connections across the literary texts. So we have our thematically linked novels, and this has similarities with the domestic qualification as well, although we have slightly different groupings, but we're looking at thematic groups. So in the grouping of growing up, candidates have a choice, and they can choose from the colour purple, Great Expectations, and What Maisie Knew. There is colonization and after, which is suggesting sort of post-colonial approaches. And we have their Heart of Darkness, Selvin's Lonely Londoners, and A Passage to India. In theme 3, with science and society, the choice is from Frankenstein, The Handmaid's Tale, and Never Let Me Go. And then finally, with women in society, we have the choice of Beloved, Mrs. Dalloway, and Wuthering Heights. And as in other sections of the assessments, there will be 2 potential questions provided, and candidates will be invited to respond to one in an essay-based response. Looking once again, and we're seeing these key concepts, these key constructs coming up, we're looking at prose fiction as genre, and we're thinking about the impact that may have on techniques being used for characterization, the sense of form and structure. And yes, we're saying, okay, this is a novel, but we're also thinking about things in terms of the internal structures within the text. So you'll find students commenting on things such as framing narratives, or some people use the sense of the storyteller as the framer, the grammatical structure, imagery, symbols, and motifs as they develop through the narrative, language choices, although as we say later, we will have a caveat about avoiding word level response, the sense of voice and voices, I would probably say. So we will have, in a first person perspective text, we will have obviously the character and their voice, but we may also think then about the authorial intentions and whether those are sort of concurrent or not. The themes of each text, which is somewhat suggested by the groupings, and use of dialogue if it's relevant to a particular question. We can say to our candidates that our questions will tend to focus on aspects of theme and narrative technique to provide them a framework for beginning their responses. So if we look at the June 2024 tasks, so we're going to just look for a moment at the growing up tasks, and we'll look at how these are presented to us. It is AO4, so we are beginning quite clearly with the word compare. You know, we are considering texts that may be different in terms of time, they may be different in terms of formal choices, they may be different in terms of perspective, and we're looking to explore or interrogate the way these texts deal with potentially similar themes. And with the text that your candidates choose, in this particular question, they're asking about the idea of self-discovery and how that can be tracked through the text. The second option discusses the influence of positive relationships. So we can see quite clearly that this is the format the question takes. It reminds the student they must compare. It's comparing the ways. So again, the word ways is telling us that we focus on technique and prose fiction techniques. And writers are mentioned so that we focus on the writers. There can be a tendency with some candidates working at the lower range of performance to become subsumed in character. And we must try and avoid that idea of the character as a real person. The character is a construct and it is one of the functions of the text. And if we can keep that clear, that we're thinking about the writers and what the writers are doing. And it is an exploration. So in this case, we're looking at the idea of self-discovery, and it will be a case of the candidate maybe having to consider what they think that means before we sort of embark on what it looks like in the given texts. Similarly, in question 3, we have that same structure at the opening of the question. And then if we look again at the key steer, influence of positive relationships. So we want them to avoid just describing a relationship that they judge to be positive. We're thinking about the influence of those relationships potentially on character development or on the development of a theme. So looking at the way it's phrased, it's to encourage a discussion. The candidate is interrogating, they're engaging with the text. We want their personal response. We want it supported by analysis of how the writer's achieving it. The wording will not change in the opening, as we said. It will appear after chosen texts. So we saw there a slight difference. One was asking you to explore, one was asking to examine the influence. While not stated, the candidates must address context and make those connections. So it's very clear that they must make the connections and context must become part of the answers. And we will look more closely at context this morning because we're thinking about those that we think are worthy of consideration in relation to that particular task. So we don't want bolt-on or descriptive chunks of context. We want context as it refers to one particular question. So thinking about that question from the task, again, we want candidates to think about an opening or closing line. And this can be a really useful task to try in the classroom. So before they even get through to planning and extending a response, they're thinking about their critical position. What is their view of that particular theme or that particular technique in their texts? And therefore, what do they feel they will open and close their critical argument with? How are they going to show quite early on that they have focused on ways? So they're showing us quite clearly from an early stage that they're dealing with presentation of a particular theme. How could we advise them to structure an answer to avoid those pitfalls, as we said, the pitfall of talking of characters as real people, the pitfall of presenting purely descriptive context, or falling into that danger of narrative and description that's not sort of evaluating or dealing with techniques. What could they do for a plan, particularly given that they're dealing with two, at times quite challenging texts, and what form should that plan take if they present it in the examination? So we don't have a specified method. Some may work for candidates better than others. We've mentioned, as we've mentioned before, that they can sometimes begin using techniques that they've used at GCSE, although we do stress that we would like them to move beyond that. They're not actively discouraged, but they don't seem to be as effective in allowing candidates to interrogate those connections, to work with questions, to possibly even challenge aspects of questions on some examples. Thinking of your opening and closing line, what we'd like them to do is clearly show a position in relation to the key term of the question, but maybe not necessarily just restating the key term. We know the candidates do want to show that they have read the question, but we don't just want to say, I've been asked to write about self-discovery. But if they begin with sort of quite a confident definition of what they feel that means or what that looks like in the pair of texts, that is then coming closer to this personal critical response that we're hoping they will achieve. So if we took the fact of looking at something like appearance and reality, we would refer back to the terms of a task, but we would try and structure in particular ways to avoid, as we said, the narrative approach. And what we've found is that when candidates attempt to address long narrative in chronological order, not always, but it can be less likely to reach sophisticated. So if they take a very linear approach, and I think certainly one or two of you have mentioned in the poetry earlier on this morning, when a candidate takes that line by line by line approach or page by page by page, they sort of lose opportunities to look for those meaningful collections, to look for structure in terms of the big picture, the macro level. So we would urge caution with candidates. They don't need to tell us everything that happens in between sort of their chosen examples or their chosen references. Thinking about narrative technique and what it looks like in prose versus other texts. So the idea of an imagery or a motif as it's followed through a text, is it changing at certain points of the text, for example? Is it always represented with the same cluster of imagery, with the same, should we say, semantic fields? Are we seeing repeated language being used to present these symbols and motifs, or is there a shift? In terms of dialogue, how does that function for characterization? And in terms of voice, and particularly, some of the texts, I'm thinking of something like Beloved, there is that myriad voices as we encounter them through the text, the voices through the ages, the various women, the various times, and there's so much exploration that can be done of voice and what do we mean by voice. The point we made about language is trying to avoid, in a text for prose fiction, trying to avoid mere word level analysis. If the work is lengthy, we don't want at that level where a student is talking about one single word and the effect of that word. We're thinking about what writers are doing across a broad canvas. So we're thinking about yes, we can look at that word, but only in terms of, is it part of a pattern for a symbol or motif or an image? And how is that being developed throughout the text and at different points in the text? And it's getting away from analysis that sounds more like extract work, because it's not going to help them achieve that higher level, and it's not going to help them make meaningful comparisons to the second novel. They definitely could benefit from using a plan because it is quite a complex task. And it's up to the student the type of plan they do. The visual learners do like mind maps or illustrations, bullet points are fine. It's quite heartening when you see the plan, because we do get a sense that someone has thought through elements of the answer. And again, thinking about amount of time, we are aware candidates are under time constraint, and we are aware that there are some complex thoughts. Looking at the colonization and after tasks. So we're looking at exploring the use of power. So again, we can see this word explore coming after chosen texts. So reminding us one more time, the questions will stay identical as far as the words chosen text. They will always remind a candidate they must compare. They will always remind the candidate they must talk about writers and the ways in which they do something, in other words, techniques. And they'll always be reminded to talk about relevant contextual factors. And the steer changes at the end of the question. So in this case, it's an exploration of the use of power in those texts. And if you're looking at text through time, you might look at power, again, in a range of ways. You might look at a societal level. So you may look at elements of colonization, for example, in Heart of Darkness, or you might look at it in that sort of individual or micro level in how particular characters interact or particular power struggles within the text. The second question of the need for human connection. And again, it's drilling down and finding useful examples that can be demonstrated at a variety of levels. And with contextual factors, it may be looking at, almost the opposite of that, the dehumanization of peoples and societies. So you can be thinking about which contextual factors could be relevant for this question and could help us explore or illuminate the key themes within those texts. So let's take power. So if we're thinking about a plan, we want the candidates to explore the term. And when we see explore, we want them to think about it on a variety of levels. So they could start by thinking about, what does it mean in my chosen novels? Is it political power? Is it, as we said, someone's personal or emotional power over another individual? Is it the social or historical background of colonial power and the results of that? Is it a physical power over someone in a particular example they've chosen? Is power instrumental, or is it influential, or is it both? So looking at these types of ideas helps them to extend their evaluation and enrich and sustain their arguments. And we are being fair. We wouldn't expect an answer in the time to cover all of these or simply just list them. But the sense is that, if they show awareness that there maybe is more than one way of looking at power, we can sense that we're on to a student who has a discriminating and a controlled approach to the text. We are not expecting miracles. We wouldn't be expecting all of this in one answer. So say the student decided they wanted to remain with political and personal. Can we just take a moment and in chat box, if this was your candidate and they were planning, and you may or sort of may not know the text, so it's Lonely Londoners, Heart of Darkness, and A Passage to India. If you're less familiar with these, if we imagine this would be the question for the text that you teach at your centre, and if we were thinking about power, and this candidate is picked political and personal, if you can just type in the text box the contextual factors you think might be worth linking to this answer, this exploration of power answer. And obviously, if you're not as aware of these texts, you might need to sort of adapt it slightly. But we're thinking more in terms of how would a candidate introduce a relevant context, either for these or for the text that you're familiar with. And we have a few examples here of things that someone might have included. The Belgian Congo, any patriarchal structures or hierarchies, and then possibly looking at the text as modernist texts. So that would be 3 possible approaches. So if you do know the texts, any further contexts or context points that might be relevant. If you're not so familiar with these texts, think about power in the text that you would be working with, and which sort of contextual factors would work with those. And let's not forget our literary context as well. So, you have the idea of text talking to each other and talking back. And we have there Heart of Darkness, Things Fall Apart, and Ashebi's response. Could be a very relevant discussion of context. And Lonely Londoners, as a more modern text, could give you quite an interesting contrast. We say compare, we're looking for similarities and differences. So we're looking there at a more modern setting, but how do these power struggles enact themselves in Selvin's Lonely Londoners, if you know that text? Or as we said, thinking of your centre and your texts, the student had to explore power. How could you link the text contexts? And do just add those to the chat box as we go through. So, potential relevant contexts. We can look at the writer's biographical context, so thinking about what was happening, place and time of writing, but only obviously when they relate to the text. We don't need the biography. We just need to see, is there anything relevant that may be pertinent to that particular question? Historical setting will come into view in most of the selections that students make. And again, it's the sense of making it relevant to that particular question. So we don't need a long standalone paragraph citing the text in history, but it is useful, obviously, to show awareness of the text and where it comes from. And yes, the colonial legacy, for example, with those texts is going to be key, isn't it? It's the impact and how it has shaped those societies and how life has been influenced by that legacy. And likewise, if we were in, say, for example, the growing up theme, then people mention things such as Bildungsroman as a literary genre, but also we'd look at the various particular specific hardships that characters face. And there is, what can be termed intersectionality sometimes. There are sort of a series of contexts that sort of coalesce and are demonstrated and illuminated throughout the text. The social and cultural context, and students explore this in different ways. They can explore it within sort of the diegetic world, the world within the narrative. They can also maybe explore it in terms of potentially initial reception of the ideas versus maybe our reception today and ideas maybe that are set in historical time. It can be, for literary context, a literary movement or a genre. And subgenres. We mentioned Bildungsroman for a moment. We mentioned modernism for the colonial text. So again, those are two very different contexts, but we can look at both. You can look at how the text has been sort of edited and received over time. And that can be done in quite a meaningful way. So it can be looked at in terms of providing a lens for particular ideas. There can be quite a lot of information out there, and it's helping candidates to filter and discriminate, and then hopefully present discriminating answers, because what they'll need to do is they're needing to show knowledge, they're needing to select relevant examples, and they're needing to select relevant contexts. So not necessarily giving us everything that they've learned, but knowing which parts of what they've learned are relevant to that particular question, that particular theme. And some of this will come from teachers. Some of it may be some independent learning. They could possibly go online. So there are some historical documents on places like YouTube. We don't always think of it as that useful, but you may have, for example, filmed interviews. We have an example of E.M. Foster speaking about a passage to India. We can, if you have large enough groups or cohorts, introduce presentation tasks where we might set individuals or pairs to work on very specific contexts that they will share with the group and therefore share information. They can look at very particular sources. So students, for example, have sometimes made meaningful connections between Conrad's Congo Diary and then how things are represented in the fiction of Heart of Darkness. And then there are other ways we can make it interactive. So we can, for example, get students to quiz each other on the contexts and work on other people's responses. What we're trying to avoid is, as we call it, the chunk or the chunk. Too often candidates will start their answer, they're very keen to show us AO3, and we might get an introductory paragraph which goes through a series of points and facts about historical context or a writer's biography. But if we can't make it relevant to the particular question, the exploration of power or looking at various elements, then it's not sort of part of an effective answer. So looking at this use of power, saying don't just sort of talk about a summary of the author's life, we're thinking about how the life may have influenced the way they chose to approach the theme. And there's various ways of approaching this. We can look obviously at life lived experience, but we can also look maybe at, we mentioned earlier, Chaby's Things Fall Apart. We can look at texts that either answer back or get into a dialogue with each other, or we can look at the writer's own previous works and see how that maybe guides us as to influencing the theme. Level 5 would ask for AO3 that we have a sophisticated evaluation and appreciation of significance and influence. And it's that significance and influence that is key. If the context is just put in a descriptive fashion, it really will not move the argument forward. So those sophisticated links, which are actually at times quite challenging to do, it's thinking about what they have learned about the texts and their context and thinking about how that might illuminate the particular theme of the question and how that might be a helpful part of their own personal response. Various tools that we could use. They can use Google Scholar, although the content, as we say, if it is pitched a little bit too high for some candidates, and we know obviously there may be a subscription. Many centres use JSTOR. There are other subscriptions such as eMagazine and English Review. We have that sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek comment about good old books. And we did say film and TV adaptations, as long as they're used with caution and they're not sort of used to present variations on the printed text, can provide a meaningful context in a way of looking at how reception has been at different points in time. And there is just a tiny point about AI. It can become the bane of our life if students are using it and not acknowledging it, but it can also be a very useful revision tool for students and their independent learning. So if they practice putting in very focused steers, so they might take that point of power and they might themselves break it down into, as we said, instrumental, influential, political, personal, physical. And if they continue to sort of use AI to input those sub-prompts, if you like, to ask for, how is this represented or how is it presented, it will just hopefully give them maybe 4 or 5 or 6 potential ideas or approaches to think about. And if they think of AI in that sense, it's a learning tool. It's a potential planning tool for those students who find it hard to structure their arguments for this question. It might help them just jolt them in terms of meaningful comparisons they'd make between their 2 paired texts. And what they need to be encouraged is that it will never produce an effective response. So they need to know it's not as simple as typing in the essay question and getting an answer, but they can use some of these 300-400 word prompt answers that they get as a basis for a plan. Or they can take what it generates and they can look to select references, or they can actually take a critical eye over an AI generated answer and actually critique it, because they are not without their problems, they are not without slightly irrelevant material, and it can be a good critical exercise to show the students that actually AI cannot always be 100% trusted. But it does allow them, as we say, a chance for some independent learning, particularly for this quite challenging task. So with this, the examiner's report for June 2024 noted that, on on the whole, responses were eloquent and thoughtful. Candidates clearly did engage with their texts. But at times, there was just a lack or a struggle to articulate the way that writers used their method and their literary technique. So we clearly had candidates who were fully aware of their narrative, they were fully aware of their characters and the motivation, but they sometimes just struggled to try and make that link between what they understand about the character or the point in the narrative and how a particular method or technique was being used, either at that micro level or stepping back to that macro level of structure. And it's that idea of development of theme and development of character. And if there is an unusual structural choice made, why does it happen at that point in the text? I'm thinking about, again, something like Beloved, and where she sort of disintegrates into memory and she's talking about the experience on the ship, and it's all the women's voices through time, and the text changes to illustrate that. So it's a very important point about how structure is reflecting the message that she's trying to get across. AO1 and AO2 are still heavily weighted. So we have spoken quite length about AO3, but we must remember that AO1 and AO2 are definitely still there. So we need to make sure that we talk about narrative technique to get the attainment where it needs to be. So sometimes we have the opposite problem. Candidates are so aware of the need to talk about context that they almost lose sight of what the writer is doing. So there is a challenge to balance, and there is a challenge to bring in sufficient relevant context while still driving through with, I believe this is how the writer is using this technique to explore this particular theme or this particular technique. And it's the idea of balance will get the sophistication and the cogency. So coming back to the uses of power question. And some students, when they do reach that level 5, they might sort of really be taking things like previous critical readings or points as points of reception, so AO3 sort of context of reception, and they might really focus on and interrogate their prior learning. So if we took this quotation about the text, the use of polyvalent symbols, the knitters of the wool, the grove of death, and Kurtz himself, connection to symbolism and his famous hazy literary technique, those more to impressionism. And if they took that and used some of that as a basis for exploring the power of various characters, and the knitters, they're both an allusion to sort of mythic characters, but also the sense of knitting the narrative and also the sense of who holds power in that particular scene. They're seemingly background characters, yet they do seem to sort of hold his attention. The sense again of Kurtz and what Kurtz may or may not represent. The symbolism and how that actually tracks to the experience of Marlowe. And is it impressionism? Would you argue that? Would you counter that? And it's the candidate taking that as potentially an AO3 reception and using it to talk about power. They could look, if it was Foster's Passage of India, at the symbolism of the cave and the destabilizing effect of the echo. And we look maybe at ambiguity in text and why it might be there. So if there is a point of potential ambiguity, potential confusion, how is that actually furthering the narrative? And here, there's a suggestion that you could argue both texts are, one person say modernist, another might say impressionistic, and that could be sort of a level of interrogation. Once you've made a connection like this, you can then clearly show AO4. So this is what we mean. If we're looking for a level 5 AO4, that would be the level we would look at. We would say we think there's maybe a generic link. We're drawing it with quite a specific quote, quite a specific angle, and then we're thinking about how that might be demonstrated in the two texts at various points. So it's making a link maybe more than just the idea of there is ambiguity in both texts. It's looking at technically, what does that ambiguity look like? And then thinking about what is the purpose of it? How does that contribute to the narrative that comes across? So to get those higher levels, from 3, we're looking at clear. From 4, we're looking at discriminating. From 5, we're looking at critical. So if we think about that, in terms of 3, 4, 5, we certainly want to be clear. We hopefully want to be discriminating and starting to choose examples that fit with the question. And then at the final level, we want to certainly have a critical understanding. They know how texts are crafted. They have a sense of the writer at work. They have a sense at how the character, the setting, and the plot or authorial constructs. Often the characteristic of a level 1 or a level 2 is that these characters and the worlds they inhabit are being discussed as though they are real people and it is the real world. To get the level 3 and above, there's a clear grasp that this is a created or a constructed world, a constructive narrative, and these are various constructs that are being used in various functions to help the writer deal with their themes. It may be that it's helpful to introduce narrative theory with some students. So if you look at narrative theory and how maybe the text would fit or subvert or link to Todorov, Freytag, and Prop. So you might look at the narrative archetypes and you might think about Kurtz and Ronnie and where they would fit. Where do we expect these characters to go? Are we thinking of them as an archetype, and then it's an authorial construct. Question that candidates often ask, is it 50-50? No, but, and we certainly don't count words, so I'll let you in a secret, we don't count words, but nevertheless, if we just had a single text, that is actually a rubric infringement and that would be costly. So ignoring one text is not the answer. And likewise, if there's a serious imbalance, it will impact the marks. So if we feel that there is sort of less confidence with one text or less exploration, it's going to be a less effective response than a balanced response. A genuinely comparative approach rather than linear will help a student reach sophisticated. So rather than dealing with one at a time, if the candidate can make connections or can find ways in which these texts can be linked or possibly contrast to each other, they are well on their way for those higher levels of performance. So it's trying to think about ways of showing those connections. We're looking now at the section B. And if we turn to pages 15 and 16 in the mark scheme, and there is a script B in your delegate pack, and this one is an answer to question 6. So this is science and society. So the candidates have chosen 2 from 3 texts, from Never Let Me Go, The Handmaid's Tale, and Frankenstein. And we can see, as before, that the first part of the setting remains the same. Compare the ways in which the writers of your 2 chosen texts. And then the question particular is asking, how do they make use of setting? And like before, if you could take maybe 5 minutes to peruse script B and think about the level you would place that response in and comments on why you've chosen that level. So if we take 5 minutes, that would take us to 47 on the clock. Okay, Debbie, with the delegate pack, if Antoinette is able to pop the link into the chat box, it's also available if you see on your Zoom where we have more, and then there should be an option to go into resources. And there we go, Antoinette has put the link up for accessing the materials. So hopefully, Debbie, if you click on that, that should let you in, and it's script B. And you'll also need the June 24, which says 2406, the mark scheme, and it's pages 15 and 16. Thanks, Antoinette. Thanks, Debbie. Hopefully you can see that now. And it's the part B, which is the prose. And just a little note on this one, because this has a different weighting, do just make sure you're looking at the right mark scheme. So you'll see that there's slightly different mark bands for level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's the one on pages 15 and 16 of the mark scheme, because we do have that slightly higher weighting on this section of the paper. To have a read through, if you'd like to suggest a level and maybe one or two comments why. And if we work our way through, at level 3, we may expect clear and relevant. At level 4, we're thinking about controlled argument and discrimination. At level 5, we're looking for that sophistication in the way it deals with contexts and techniques and so on. Okay, so certainly, as you said, David, there's definitely a discussion of a range of relevant contexts. So we're certainly getting context that is sort of applicable to the question. So you're suggesting there it would have enough for 5. Any other thoughts? If we can share them in the text box. Okay, top of 4. So we have good security and evaluation. And then possibly loss of question focus, which might keep it from 5. So far we've got 1 possibly just into 5, 1 staying just in 4, because there is possibly a loss of focus. And the AO3, we said before, maybe not fully integrated. And just remember, everyone, with this one, and in fact, I think with one of the slides I'm going to go through, remember the mark scheme for this one. This question is out of slightly more marks. So but we'll deal in levels, so don't worry too much about that right now, but it's an award out of a possible 30. Yeah, we're saying either top of level 4, lower level 5. Just a quick indication of where people would sit and if they agree, disagree. So we've got low 5. Any other takers agreeing with low 5 or high 4 or feeling strongly it's somewhere else? Okay, so Faith going with a 23, which again, we make it sort of a secure 4 on this mark scheme, so pushing towards 5, so high in 4. And some feeling enough for low 5. If we can have a few more just to see where everyone is. So we're between now, high 4, low 5. So where would you go with this? And okay, we're going with 25. And if that is the 25 on the 30, that would put it just into the 5 on this mark scheme, because remembering we're marking with a slightly extended mark scheme for this question. And we've got slightly higher weighting on the paired text. So a 25 on this, that would take it just into a 5. So we've got another low 5. Okay, so if we have a look, and the comments that were raised were all valid and constructive. And to be honest, in terms of looking at where we mark, there would not be huge concerns about those of you who placed it just into 5, because there are certainly elements, aren't there? There are flashes that we might have considered to be pushing towards sophisticated, pushing towards a cogency, but equally, because we have some of those elements that I think Faith you'd raised about not fully in control of the argument and possibly not fully integrating those contexts. So although there was a good range of contexts, they potentially were not always looked at in terms of significance. So we still had that example of a few things just being there, but not sort of being integrated in terms of significance. And it was felt that those of you who put it right to the top of 4, it actually said, I think you mentioned a mark of 23, that's pretty much on it. It certainly, we felt, met 4 fairly securely. We have a controlled argument. It was a quality of this response, actually, wasn't it? If you look at the markers between the paragraphs, there was a clear sense of the argument being structured. We did have a range of contextual factors, as we saw, and certainly they were discriminating. The factors that were mentioned did have relevance. It's pinning that significance, so it maybe wasn't always pinned with significance. The links were usually detailed, although, as we said, because it wasn't fully consistent through the text, that might be just what keeps it in 4 and doesn't push it into 5. And certainly, usually a controlled discriminating approach to integration, and usually detailed, but there was, as a few of you spotted, there's a slight tailing, which is to be understood in a timed situation, but it just maybe kept it just capped at that sort of higher end of 4. It just kept it that overall, while there were occasional flashes of what we would consider level 5 performance, the best fit for this text is sort of at the top of the 4 with a 23. So that was sort of where we went with that one. And in terms of how we could have improved it, a few comments have been raised already. There was the tailing at the end of the response that maybe wasn't quite at the level of the rest of the response. Ignore the 19 of the way that was from another text. There was also the fact that maybe some contexts were not fully integrated in terms of significance, although they were there was a little bit of adding on. So moving on then to thinking about teaching. And at those lower levels, we have those explorers, 1, 2, and 3. At level 1, they may basically visit the text. They'll find and identify, but occasionally with inaccuracies. At level 2, there may be some points that are found and commented upon, but there's maybe a lack of connection being made. When you had, for example, the unseen poetry question, a few of you did comment on the fact that the candidate didn't give us that overarching vision of the whole poem, that step back that we might expect. At level 3, we do see security. They can identify and explain, although sometimes it can be a little bit line by line, and it's not wholly secure in connecting text. They know what it is we're asking them to do, and they're doing it with a fair degree of success, but they're still sort of at that explorer stage. At 4, the exploration becomes this word discriminating. They think about what they've gathered from the text, and then they try and link it to not only the question, but in the case of section B, possible context and critical approach. In this paper, we actually deal with critical approach as sort of an AO3 reception. So they actually explore the text on a number of levels. They explore what writers are doing, and then they evaluate the effectiveness of it. And they can also look at those wider contexts and look at how texts may be connected, compared, and contrasts. They move beyond just the lexis and phonology, and there's certainly attempts at meaningful evaluation. At level 5, we get a scrutiny, but we also get an overview. It's that moving in and out, so we can get a scrutiny of specific and precise and meaningful examples, but we also get this broader picture, the bigger picture of the text, the genre, the connections, and how they might illuminate a particular point. The candidate's usually very secure in their methodology. They have a discursive purpose. They have a well-structured argument, even under time conditions. And there is that nuance that they're willing to sort of either challenge a term or even challenge themselves in terms of their own interpretations. We know that there are various ways of delivering. So there can be delivery through linear or modular. Thinking back to earlier in the meeting, I know some people felt that actually keeping poetry going from the start was quite fruitful, whereas others said that the unseen was maybe introduced a bit later, and both have benefits. And we can work with linear or modular or combinations of the above. So we've had a chance to look at some scripts and think about the AOs, and particularly with the unseen and some of the terms coming from delegates today, the idea of flexing the muscle, of looking for the heart, and doing it with that support from the text. Looking at support from Pearson, there are a range of ways that you can have support for teaching and learning, assessment, and post results. And it's tabulated on the slideshow, which you can look at in the delegate pack. Most of these can be accessed online. The website is hugely useful in terms of both looking at specification, sample assessment materials, teaching and learning materials, not just past papers, but materials for approaching various units and delivery. And those are very helpful. With exams for particular centres, there's a range of products available. Results Plus will allow direct analysis of your own cohorts. As Exam Wizard, which will allow generation of assignments, topic tests, and mock exams. There is access to the Secure portal, which is access to your own responses after a particular results session. And there are other resources there. So beyond Edexcel, there are a number of effective resources, usually produced at this point on a text-by-text basis. So there are plenty of resources out there supporting the study of the prose and the poetry texts, and there are equally resources on unseen approaches. Edexcel also publishes the course book for literature and teacher resource packs to go with particular units. Claire, who's been very nice in supporting us today, is here and can also be contacted with further queries or specific points to do with centre-related issues. And we have various online resources to refer to. We have other sort of general texts, such as Mastering English Literature, if you're doing one of the front-loading or front-forward core concept-based approaches. And there are various online resources, of which some have been mentioned today. With the session now drawing to a close, and I know it's been quite whistle stop, and I know some of you, David, you mentioned you had to dash off and do some teaching there in the middle. I do thank you for giving us your time today and coming with us on the delivery presentation. I do appreciate those contributions and delegates sharing best practice with us. If there are any pressing questions or queries that you would wish us to follow up, if you want to post those into the chats, I will sort of harvest them, if you like, and I'll take them forwards and bring them forwards to Edexcel. But I would like to thank you once again for joining us today at what I know is probably a very pressured, very busy time of year. And it has been wonderful working with you all. And before I sign off, I would just like to thank Antoinette and Claire for providing technical support and content support for us today. And it has been lovely working with you. So I wish you a productive and a relaxing day, whatever you might be doing for the rest of the afternoon. And I look forward to seeing some of you again at Unit 4 on the 25th. So I will say goodbye for now. Thank you for your time. And it has been a pleasure to work with you in the virtual space. So thank you very much.